We might kick this off. Hello, everyone. I was about to say good morning, but I can see a number of you from all around the world. And Andy, I'm assuming it's quite late. Nice to meet you on Zoom, everyone. What a pleasure to have this opportunity to engage in a rich and vibrant discussion about extinction, and to have so many people already in our room whose names are really familiar to the group of academics who write and think in this space. So it's a pleasure to be able to welcome you all to this workshop. I want to start, if I may, first by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yugara people who are the First Nation owners of the land where my university, QUT, is located. For those of you from outside of Australia, we usually acknowledge the Indigenous traditional owners of the country that we're located in, and we recognize that the land that they've been a part of have been places of teaching, research, and learning, and we recognize the sacredness of that land and the elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits that come with it. It's a pleasure to be able to welcome such a diverse group of guests to this workshop. We have a really large number of people who've registered from across the country, from Myanmar to the US. We've been very pleasantly surprised by the great deal of interest that's been shown in this workshop. And in large part, it's, I think, due to the quality of scholars that we've also managed to bring to contribute to this dialogue and this discussion. And I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to have this conversation with you all. I just want to firstly acknowledge the work that's gone into this, organizing all this. And I want to particularly thank Michelle Lim, Katie Woolaston, and Catherine Christensen, who's also helped us with the IT. We've been working on this workshop for some time, and it's been such a pleasure to be able to work with Michelle and Katie to co-host this particular project on extinction. I also want to thank Erin O'Donnell, who will be joining us as chair, and also Paul Govin, who's here already, who will be chairing a session as we go through this. But more importantly, I also want to thank all the speakers who have really generously given their time to prepare papers and to present them during this session. And I can already see Glenn. What a pleasure to have you here, Glenn. Andy, Tom, Alexandra, and obviously Lesley and Phillipa, who go this morning as well. It's a pleasure to have you all here. Thank you for making the effort to contribute. Our contributors to this workshop come from around the place, and we've organized this symposium or this workshop across 5 sessions to try and capture different time zones. And for those of you who've been trying to participate in these various workshops, it's quite a challenge organizing different time zones and getting everyone here. And Michelle has done an incredible job of achieving that for us. I'm just sharing my screen with you, which has the workshop flyer. And for those of you who've registered, you would have received an electronic copy. I'm just trying to figure out how to share. Sorry, everyone. I'm just bringing up the program so we can see it. So you'll see the way we've organized this. We've got one session from now 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, session 2, and then we've got a third session that's much later for us, but that's to accommodate Europe speakers. And then tomorrow we've got 2 more sessions at different times, and hopefully you've got access to the program and are able to participate and join as you please. So I just want to say a few words, if I may, at this stage, before I introduce the speakers. And I just want to say a little bit about the nature of this workshop and the reason for us to engage in this particular project. So even back in 1973, international law through the Convention on Endangered Species of Wild Fauna utilized the law to try and combat extinction through relatively simple methods of closing markets that had opened up to trading species. But then we've progressed and moved on quite a bit. So recently, a few years ago, IPBES, through its global assessment report on biodiversity and ecosystem services, they used the word transformative change to describe what's needed to be done for us to cope with the current extinction crisis. Now, transformative change requires that we have to reimagine and boldly shift the conceptual and the theoretical base that motivates the substantive and procedural drivers that are behind environmentally relevant laws. And in our view, transformative change needs the law, but we want to also invoke the challenge that law is both a problem and a solution for transformative change. Law as a discipline always seeks to transcend experiences, feelings, subjectivity, and even matter and material more generally. Now, this is consistent with the historical separation of the mind and matter, of wanting completeness and certainty in our systems, because ideas need to be seen as superior to the world of experience, which is more often about emergence, incompleteness, and indeterminism. Now, these comments about law should help us pause for a moment and ask whether the techniques and processes of the law are actually suited to tempering and controlling the complexities of the natural world to help avert the extinction crisis of our times. Now, the law and environmental law in particular is not a static approach to managing and dealing with issues. And we've become increasingly aware of unpredictability, change, complexity, and so on. Concepts like adaptive management, reflexivity, decentered and network governance are encouraging increasingly lawyers and policymakers to think differently about the scope and potential of environmental law to be less transcendental but holistic and locally aware. It's common though to study extinction issues by asking whether our laws are weak and need tweaking and changing. For instance, in Australia, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is the premier conservation legislation at our national level, has been going through a review for its failure to actually achieve its main purpose, which is to protect the environment. Now, one of the surprising features of our Environment Protection and Conservation Act is the idea that it is completely legal to get permits to destroy threatened species habitats and also to contribute to making species go extinct. And on a side note, I just read in the media today that our federal minister has decided to try and remove a significant Ramsar wetland from being listed in order to actually allow a massive development project to go ahead. So I'm not even sure where Australia's Commonwealth review of legislation is likely to go, but we can have these discussions later on. Now, what my comments suggest is the failure to note that jurisdiction, constitutional structures that support our federal legislation also creates problems for the law. The structures of the law, whether formal and process-oriented or ideas-based and discursive, these things that underpin environmental law are fundamental to its successes and failures. So while existing legal structures have the potential to creatively mobilize and bring together ideas and forces for governance that may not otherwise emerge, they can also lead us to believe that the law is failing us, rather than human beings whose ambitions are constrained by structures. So the subject of extinction explicitly confronts law and governance with an opportunity to interrogate and challenge its foundations, structural dispositions, and why and whether it has to worry about loss at all. Our goal with this work and this workshop is to interrogate and explore alternative imaginings of law, governance, and ultimately how we come to terms with our profound impact on those who share our planet and whom we share it with. So with that little brief introduction, I'm going to now take us through 3 papers that we have for this particular part of the workshop. And it gives me a real pleasure to be able to welcome Professor Lesley Hughes to speak to her paper first. Lesley is a distinguished professor of biology and is the Pro-Vice Chancellor at Macquarie University for Research Integrity and Development. Her work has been interested in the implications of climate change for conservation policy and practice. And in the program that you have, you'll see a whole host of accolades and work that Lesley has been doing. So it's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to listen to Lesley. When we asked our speakers to speak, we also asked them to tell us something that's a funny fact about them. And Lesley, I'm really sorry to share this, but you did it yourself, which is that as an ecologist, you've had a pet rabbit for 8 years. And in your defense, you suggest, though, it was a birthday present from your daughter, but you did always feel guilty, even though she's very cute. So Lesley, thank you for being here and for presenting. And your paper's titled A Conspiracy of Inaction, the case of the Bramble Cay Melomys. And I'll hand it over to you and we'll have you talk for about 15-20 minutes. Now, before we start, what I'd like to ask is, if you have questions for the speaker, there are two ways you can ask them. One is in the chat, and I'll collect those questions and I'll direct them to the speaker after they've finished. Alternatively, at the end, I'll invite you to try and indicate through by putting your hand up, and I'll be able to see you, and unmute yourself at that point, and I'll ask you to ask the speaker. So thank you everyone again for being here. Thank you to the speakers, and thank you for my incredible colleagues who worked with me to organize this symposium. And we'll begin with Lesley with her talk. So Lesley, if you could share your screen and we'll hand it over to you then.
Thanks very much, Afshin. And I will turn my video off under instructions first and then share. I hope that's all working. Firstly, thank you to the organisers for asking me to speak at this workshop. I'm probably the only non-lawyer amongst you, so please forgive me in advance if I make some mistakes in terms of what I'm going to say about the law. When they asked me to speak, I decided to talk about a case study to really kick this workshop off with a solid grounding of real reality. Because this case study and this, the thing that happened to this little species has actually triggered a lot of my work, and I hope you will see why. Okay. This is the Bramble Cay Melomys, or rather was the Bramble Cay Melomys. It's a little native rodent, and it now has the distinction, not just of being a small brown rat, which is not very distinctive, but it has the distinction of being the first mammalian extinction attributed to climate change globally. So a rather dubious record. This picture up in the right-hand corner is where the Bramble Cay Melomys actually used to live. It's the Bramble Cay. It's a tiny little sandy atoll in the Torres Strait. It's actually closer to Papua New Guinea, but in the Torres Strait between Northern Australia and Papua New Guinea. This was the only place that this species was found. Let me show you the time scale of what's actually happened to it. Back in the 70s, there were several hundred individuals known. By 1998, only 90. By 2002 to 2004, less than 20. By 2009, there was the last sighting of a single individual by a passing fisherman. And in 2015, it was declared presumed extinct under Queensland conservation legislation, then in 2019 under federal legislation. The Bramble Cay Melomys story interacted in two different places with legislation. It was listed as endangered under the EPBC Act that Afshin mentioned in his introduction in 2000. And in 2008, it had a recovery plan written for it, as is required under the Act. So what went wrong? And the theme of my talk is there were a lot of things that went wrong. We can think about the intersection of the law, of policy that law contributes to, and of the action that should follow from the policy. They all went wrong. And we were left with the Bramble Cay Melomys, the perfect storm in the middle, being lost. So firstly, law to policy, and I hope this segues well into what Phillipa and Kate are going to say later in this session. Firstly, neither the EPBC Act, for all its failings, this is just one of them, or the Biodiversity Conservation Strategy, which is the main Australian strategy guiding conservation in Australia, actually provide any commitment at all to preventing avoidable extinctions. And as you will see, the Bramble Cay Melomys extinction was certainly avoidable. There's no provision in Australian legislation that it's an offence to cause, contribute to, or fail to take reasonable actions to prevent an extinction, nor is there any clear chain of accountability. There is a Minister for the Environment, but their responsibility lies mainly with the assessment process rather than actually reducing the threat to the species. Further, in recovery plans, the allocation of responsibility is very vague. Many recovery plans, of course, don't get written, and even fewer are resourced. This was noted in an Auditor General's report in 2007. There's no formal inquiry required under the Act in Australia for extinctions, therefore no public process to identify and remedy any of the problems. In the policy to action space, there's other things that went wrong. Here's the front cover of the recovery plan for the Melomys. It was published in 2008. The place where this Melomys lived in the Torres Strait is undergoing sea level rise at about twice the global average. This was known when the recovery plan was written. Here is a quote from the recovery plan. Although no specific assessment of this threat has been undertaken, the likely consequences of climate change, including sea level rise and increase in the frequency and intensity of tropical storms, are unlikely to have any major impact on the survival of the Bramble Cay Melomys in the life of the plan. As I said, the recovery plan was written in 2008. The last of the species was seen in 2009. So despite the fact that it was known that sea levels were rising very, very rapidly in the Torres Strait, the author of the recovery plan did not consider it a sufficient threat to the survival of the species, and despite the fact that there were less than 20 known at the time. Here's the recovery actions and objectives in part 4 of the plan. One of them was to establish a monitoring program, clarify the extent and manage the threats, improve the understanding of its biology and ecology, facilitate community participation, despite the fact that there is no community that actually lives on this atoll. And in a breathtaking piece of tautology, the objective 5 of the recovery plan was to manage the recovery program. There was no provision anywhere in the recovery plan for any emergency response, despite the species being literally on its last legs, including captive breeding. And this was actually due to the fact that there were a couple of key individuals in the Queensland government who decided that captive breeding was a bad idea. In fact, if you do a word search for these phrases in the recovery plan, captive breeding, translocation, assisted colonisation, or climate adaptation, none of them appear at any stage. In effect, this species was monitored, sort of, until it went extinct without any action taken. In fact, John Woolaston wrote a letter to Nature. He's a very well-known ecologist in Australia, saying that with a population of at most a few hundred and a range limited to a single small island less than 5 hectares that is susceptible to inundation in storm surges, the Melomys was already living on the brink of extinction, yet not one iota of effort was made or resources committed to reduce its vulnerability. John Woolaston and colleagues wrote a very influential review that I think Phillipa will also refer to, published in 2016, which takes a sort of a coronial approach to the recent extinctions of 3 species, including the Melomys, but also the Christmas Island pipistrelle and the Christmas Island skink, and I would recommend that paper. So the question is, could this happen again? And my answer to that is yes, almost certainly. Because not only have we got these 3 things, the law, policy and actions failing this species, there are a whole bunch of other things that I'll very briefly mention that go along with this that also contribute to this failure. Firstly, compliance. I'm a director of WWF, so I'll declare that, but I'll mention a WWF report published earlier this year about the number of Australian animals that have been lost and could still be lost through non-compliance with the EPBC Act. In fact, they estimate that between 2010 and 2018, at least 30 million animals were lost, which could have been prevented in 2 states alone due to lack of compliance. It describes an attitude of pervasive non-compliance of referral obligations, especially by what's called agricultural developers, which I think is actually a rather coy way of referring to farmers. Resources. Brendan Wintle and colleagues at Melbourne University have estimated that only $122 million per annum is currently spent on threatened species programs in Australia. It's about 15% of what is needed, and it's about 1/10 of what is spent in the US endangered species program, which has a similar number of endangered species. And just by way of context, each of the 12 new attack class submarines ordered by the Australian government will cost more than $18 billion over their lifetime. That's $18 billion each. And finally, thinking. And I pose the question, even if we had the laws, the policies and the resources, would the right actions be taken, especially in the face of climate change? I got really cross about the Bramble Cay Melomys, so started to do a little bit of research about how well recovery plans under the EPBC Act actually cope with climate change. Are they climate ready? We sampled 100 randomly chosen plans published since 1997, 50 of plants and 50 of animals. And we found that only 57% mentioned climate change as a threat. I'm not quite sure what's happened to that other number. Only 22% of those plans tie specific recovery actions to climate change, and only 9% recommended any form of interventionist action, such as captive breeding or translocation. I think there's another bit of research that I want to mention, which is really pointing to this cognitive dissonance in the face of conservation management, in the face of climate change. This is a paper by Hageman and Satterfield. They surveyed 160 experts, scientists and practitioners with quite a lot of specific expertise about climate change and biodiversity conservation. They basically all agreed that there was a need for active management and restoration interventions, but when provided with a choice between an interventionist action like translocation versus a traditional action like, say, controlling invasive species, they overwhelmingly chose the latter. Another survey that a student and I did a couple of years ago was for restoration practitioners in New South Wales doing revegetation. Overwhelmingly, these practitioners, when choosing species to plant in restoration sites, actually considered that they should choose species that would be sustainable under climate change. But when you look at the actions that they had actually taken, only 45% were preparing to take actions, and less than 1/3 of those practitioners had any future focus on a long-term restoration goal. So in conclusion, we are failing species through multiple issues. We do have inadequate environment protection laws, and I know they are going to be the subject of much of this workshop. but there are many, many other intersecting issues that are also contributing to the problem that we need to look at for context. There is a lack of accountability by decision makers, by policy makers, as well as those in government. There is a lack of compliance. We could have the best laws in the world, but if compliance is not enforced, they are toothless tigers. In Australia, at least, there is an enormous lack of resourcing. And then when we come down to people actually doing actions on the ground, especially in relation to the rapidly changing environmental complex, we have very, very old-fashioned, what I would call equilibrium thinking, and a lack of bold action. And I think we need to address all of these issues and address them simultaneously if we are not going to lose any more species. Okay, thank you very much.
Lesley, thank you very much for that. Fantastic, and I can see lots of claps going up digitally. Fantastic. Lesley, I think you'll find one of the fantastic things about these workshops is we have opportunity from scholars like yourself who come in and look at the law and provide really interesting perspectives about how it needs to be contextualized and how it needs to be socialized and discussed in a broader context rather than narrowly. So it's a pleasure to be able to hear you give us that overview and to discuss the details in relation to a species. I'm going to invite questions now, and there's two ways we'll proceed. One is either through the chat, or if someone wants to ask a question, if they unmute themselves, I'll see you and invite you to ask a question. And then at the end, I might also bring the three speakers into a conversation, if they like, from the audience as well, if they've got questions at the end. So see if we've got questions. But thank you, Lesley, for that. And I'll hand it over to the audience to see if someone wants to kickstart us off. We have probably about 5 minutes or 10 minutes to engage in dialogue. And
I have a question. If
yeah, Tom,
yeah,
fantastic to see you here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. Thanks very much, Lesley. And I'm another one of the non-lawyers, so excuse the ignorance of this question. And
we shall unite then.
And apologies for asking you a question about the law in front of a group of lawyers. But I guess I was just very curious about some of your opening comments. I hadn't appreciated that the EPBC was so well, I don't want to say meaningless, but I guess I had assumed that there was a prohibition on what I think we still call take, like as in the American legislation, on all of these sorts of ways of killing, harming, removing listed species. But it sounded like that is not prohibited.
Well, there are prohibitions, and look, I don't know the law backwards as well as I should, but extinction, you know, there is no responsibility for extinction. So, you know, that WWF report that I briefly mentioned, for example, also highlights the fact that, for example, since the koala has been listed as threatened, it's lost hundreds of thousands of hectares of habitat. So just listing the real toothless part of the Act is that listing a threatened species does not then necessarily protect it from any form of harm, such as habitat loss. So it sort of does in theory, but it doesn't really in practice. And then when people go and do illegal clearing, for example, the fact that there's listed species on their property doesn't actually force any sort of form of compliance, which is more of a cultural thing with this particular government, I would suspect. But I think all of those things come together to make the Act actually reasonably meaningless.
Thank you.
And let's hope that the Samuels review, which is currently under wraps and we hope to be released soon, actually addresses some of those things. But there is a whole bunch of other things that conservation groups are focusing on with regard to the review of the Act, such as, for example, the devolution of responsibility for the environment to the states, which is what the government wants to do. So the Commonwealth wants to just basically pass the buck of all responsibility for major environmental issues to the states.
Thanks.
Can I also at this stage just note that there's, I don't want to be the face of any lawyer here. And so I just want to note there's a whole host of scholars in the room as well who probably know quite a bit about the EPBC Act who may also want to come in and comment. I just wanted to know that in case anyone's looking to the lawyers for any certainty here, Tom, just and Lesley. I just want to bring up a question, Lesley, that's in the chat from Yin Yin Win asking whether, may I know the public participation and awareness raising for preserving the Melomy?
I'm not quite sure what the question means. Yin Yin, do you mean, maybe you could come on unmute, do you mean subsequent to its extinction? What sort of awareness raising that there's been subsequently? Or do you mean the awareness raising while it was in its decline? I'll assume it could be either of those things. I think for the latter, I think very, very few people had ever heard of the Melomys before it went extinct. I mean, it is, you know, fairly nondescript little brown rat, and people don't care about little brown rats as much as they care about koalas, for example. I think certainly when it was declared extinct, both in Queensland, then by the IUCN, and then officially by the federal government in 2019, that did produce a flurry of newspaper articles, pieces in the conversation, etc. So there were, and those papers such as the ones by John Winowski et al. So there was awareness raised at that time. When it was declared the first mammalian extinction due to climate change that had been well documented, that also raised a lot of awareness amongst ecologists and the scientific community. How much that filtered down into public perception, I couldn't say.
Yes, I'm Yin. Just I want to know about the public participation for preserving Melomy in your country. I mean, for grassroots level. Yes.
At the grassroots level?
Yes,
yes.
Yes.
Well, I think the answer to that is that very few people would have ever heard of it till it went extinct, because it was only lived on this tiny little island a long way from where anybody lived. It's actually, as I said, closer to Papua New Guinea than it is to Australia, though it is under Australian jurisdiction. So virtually nobody except perhaps some of the locals up there on the coast would have known it was there. Certainly some ecologists in the Department of Environment federally and in Queensland knew it was there, but that's about it. So, you know, essentially it was out of sight, out of mind, and it was allowed to go extinct. You know, the last of the species would have simply drowned in a storm. That's what would have happened to it, and there's good evidence of that happening. And so it was one of these things that just left the planet without people even noticing till later. That's the real tragedy.
Yes, I got it. Yeah.
Thank you, Yin Yin. I just note one of our participants has just commented on how we have quite a number of participants from Myanmar, and I might ask in a little while, if they don't mind, just introducing themselves to us. I think it would be really nice to meet you, but I might give you a moment just to do that before we do that. There's a comment, Lesley, in the chat from Dan Rogers, and Dan, welcome to this. It's nice to have you with us here, saying, thank you, Lesley. Michelle Ward led a great paper highlighting the extent to which nationally listed threatened species habitat is removed without any referral to the Act. That is worthwhile context.
Yes. Yes, I'm aware of that paper, and also Martin Taylor from WWF has done some really outstanding work on that as well. So yes, which is just another reason why the EPBC Act is regarded mostly as a toothless tiger in terms of actually protecting species.
Thank you, Lesley. And I think Matthew's gone on. Matthew, do you want to come online and just make that comment yourself directly? So he says that, so a number of these concepts are not always clear. We have no species recoveries plans under Myanmar law. The biodiversity law is still heavily managed by the Forest Department, who are foresters and not ecologists.
Mm. Yes, look, I can see that problem. I guess what I was talking about was that even when we do have recovery plans, now called conservation advices, as part of our federal legislation, it still doesn't protect things. So yes, I think you do definitely have a problem if people who are foresters rather than conservation ecologists have that decision-making responsibility. You do need to change that as well. But even though in Australia we have a different situation, there are similar sorts of problems in terms of outcomes.
Thanks, Lesley. And I should note, sorry, I think it's quite early for those of you in Myanmar, and it sounds like it's about 6:30 a.m. So thank you for being here. Glenn,
yes,
Albrecht,
only 6
sorry.
a.m. early in the morning in our country right now. Yes.
Thanks. So you're Professor of Law. Would you mind
Yes,
introducing yourself, Yini, when you're there?
yes, I'm member of WWF. Yes, I joined IMCN curriculums in Cebu in 2017 May. And then I'm also trainer TTT in environmental law, focus person for Myanmar, appointed by Asian Development Bank. I have a lot of friends in ADB and also IUCN. I used to do awareness raisings for local community in Tanindari region, supported by IUCN Academy of Environmental Law. Thank you all. Yes.
Thank you. Lesley, sorry to interrupt your flow with the introduction, but I thought it's nice to hear from others from Myanmar. Glenn, do you mind making your comment verbally, which is in the chat? It'd be nice to hear from you.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes, Glenn.
Yeah, the paper was great, and I fully accept the idea that we need to radically shift some of the thinking that underpins past failure. And with others in 2012, we had a go at the ethics of relocation in the age of anthropogenic climate change. And two of the case studies that we looked at, one of them was the mountain pygmy possum and the other one was the polar bear. Mm-hmm. And to keep the pygmy possum in its preferred habitat, we decided to move it to New Zealand just as a conceptual issue. And the polar bear, we renamed it Antarcticos and moved it to the South Pole because that's the only place where permanent ice would be found, and also a suite of potential prey. We fenced off the penguins just in case anyone's really worried about polar bears eating all the penguins. But it was to try and get us to think about the ethics of relocation and just how radical these changes to ecosystems will be. And Lesley's rat is a good example of it. We weren't even prepared to think about moving it to a higher island somewhere and give it a chance to live. So you can imagine the ethics of moving not so small animals, and that's the situation we're moving into. So I was wondering what Lesley thinks of the radical edge of the action needed to get us out of the inaction that our current legal and action system has delivered.
You're a man after my own heart, Glenn. I mean, I've been advocating for far more radical interventions for at least the last 10 to 15 years. You might recall, you might be aware of my colleague David Bowman's paper in Science, where he advocated bringing in elephants from Africa to the Northern Territory to eat invasive African gamba grass.
I remember.
Yeah, pilloried. You know, David is an out-of-the-box thinker as well. Look, I think, you know, we need, you know, and I realise that your suggestions were not totally serious, though it might come to that. But as you say, we weren't even prepared to move a few rats to a higher island, let alone put them in a zoo and so avoid their extinction. Actually getting to the point of moving species is enormously difficult from both a policy and a legislative perspective. I'm actually at the moment with a couple of colleagues trying to collate all the instances in the world of moving species for a climate change threat reason. And there are less than five instances of doing that. And until recently, I only knew of 2 in the last 30 years. So I think we need a completely different mindset. It is what I referred to in my talk as equilibrium thinking, that everything should be in the place where it was when we were 5 years old, and that's how the world should be. Setting aside the notion that, you know, 50 million years ago, Australia was covered in rainforest. It wasn't better or worse, it was just different. I think we need to be more psychologically relaxed about where things live in order that they live somewhere. As you will be aware of the huge debate in the literature about translocation or assisted colonisation, you know, the general objection put up is that, oh, it's too risky because something might eat something where it gets moved to, regardless of the risk of extinction in the place where it is now if we do nothing. And I think there is absolute cognitive dissonance in terms of risk assessment and cost-benefit analyses in conservation generally. It is far easier to do something negative for the environment like clear than it is to do something positive for a threatened species. And I think facing up to that cognitive dissonance is something that's really, really critical moving forward.
Thank you.
That's fantastic, Lesley. And we might now stop here. I'm trying to figure out how we acknowledge and thank you as speakers in Zoom. Or do we just put up our hands? But thank you so much.
Put a hand up. That's fine.
Thank you for this presentation and for the questions. I might just quickly take a moment and just ask before we go on to the next. Professor Yin Yin Win, you might see there's a couple of notes in the chat room welcoming you and thanking you for your commitment to conservation work. And I wanted to ask whether there's other scholars from Myanmar who are here that I might not recognize their names, who may just want to quickly introduce themselves if there is, but I can't tell. So.
Yes, all of those are from my department, lecturers. Those are lecturers from my department. I would like to develop human resource for environmental conservation in Myanmar. So I encourage them to attend this seminar for our environmental law curriculum development, and then for enhancing learning and teachings for environmental legal education in Myanmar. So I give them the floor. Yes.
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself, all of my colleagues.
Good morning, all. I'm Chuchurin at Road Department, Dongji University. Nice to meet you all.
Fantastic. Thank you. And others who might just turn their screen on or just speak if you don't want to go on the screen. All right.
Yes, and for other participants in Myanmar, my colleagues from law department, please introduce yourself to the audience and the organizer for this workshop. Do Tantan, Donan, Susu and Don Hin Nguyen and Donan Cleawen, please. I'm giving the floor to you.
You're on mute. You just have to quickly unmute yourself.
Mingalava, I'm Nancy Sushen from Tangi University. I'm a lecturer.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you all.
Thank you very much. Great to have you here. Might just quickly go around to the others.
Yes, I'm Totan Tang U, lecturer from Dongji University. Nice to meet you all.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I'm Nang Liao. I'm assistant lecturer from Dongji University. Nice to meet you all.
Great to meet you. All right. I'm assuming that's it. So thank you very much. Thank you for being part of this workshop, and thank you everyone else. So I'm going to move on now to the second speaker in this thread about law, and it gives me, oh, sorry. We had one more, I missed that. Go ahead, sorry, introduce yourself and then I'll move on.
Hello, I am named Downey University. I'm a lecturer.
Fantastic, thank you and welcome to this workshop on extinction. Nice to have you all here. So it's always a pleasure for me to have an opportunity to introduce Katie Woolaston, who's going to speak to her paper. Katie's PhD was in wildlife law and conservation conflicts, and I think she's in the process of turning that PhD into a book, and it'll be fantastic to see it come out hopefully next year. Katie's done an incredible amount since completing her PhD, and recently she was an expert on the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services panel concerning biodiversity and pandemics, and is an editor on the Asia Pacific Journal of Environmental Law and a board member of the National Environmental Law Association, and does an amazing amount of other things in her life. Not sure how she manages to fit all this stuff in, along with having a family to take care of as well. It's always a pleasure to listen to Katie's work as she crosses across disciplines really beautifully and brings them together into a nice synergy to talk about law. Now, one of the fun facts about Katie, as we asked the speakers, is that she was bitten by a snake when she was a kid, and her PhD research, which is on human-wildlife coexistence, meant that she had to try and overcome phobias about snakes. And for those of you who might know parts of Brisbane where we live, we're constantly having to deal with pythons, and Katie's familiar with that, where she has to constantly remove snakes from her hen house. So I'm sure that's a lot of fun, Katie. Katie, over to you to talk about empathy and compassion and legal extinction issues. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you for that introduction, Afshin. Hopefully I can live up to that hype. Can I just check that you can see my slides?
Yep, looks good.
Perfect. Thank you. I just first of all want to reiterate Afshin's comments and thank everybody for coming today. It's great to see so many people from different areas. And I'd like to also acknowledge the Yagara people, and I'm currently in Yagara country, and I pay my respects to the elders there. Today I'm going to talk to a paper that Afshin and I have been working on with respect to the links between species extinction, law and emotion such as compassion and empathy. So in our paper we try to do this in the context of the legal decision making around the Yeelirrie uranium mine, which is to be an open pit mine around 500 kilometres north of Kalgoorlie in Western Australia. The decision to allow that mine to proceed was made notwithstanding the fact that the best scientific evidence showed that 11 stygofauna and 1 troglofauna species, I think that's how you say them, some of the ecologists can correct me if I'm wrong, that they would go extinct as a result of the development of the mine. So for us, this raised questions about how law can allow this despite that gut feeling that many of us have that suggests that this is not right or unjust. So first we will explore what that feeling is, how it's categorised and where it comes from before assessing its relevance in environmental law and the Yearly case itself. Okay, so I'm going to preface this discussion on emotions by acknowledging that both Afshin and myself are lawyers, not psychologists or cognitive scientists. But if you're interested in the references for what I'm about to talk about, you can let us know and we'll send them through to you. So what is empathy? Empathy is typically thought to be the state of taking the perspective of the other and feeling an emotional bond over that perspective. It generally has emotional and cognitive components. So while emotional empathy relates to experiencing another person's emotional responses, the cognitive component refers to the capacity to understand others' emotions. The terms that describe empathy, compassion, and sympathy are often used interchangeably, but excuse me, but generally they're considered to be separate emotions leading to different reactions. But for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on empathy. Excuse me, sorry. I'm going to focus on the emotion of empathy today. However, I will note that most of the authors in this area agree that these concepts, all of these emotions, are under the same emotional umbrella, so to speak, and that people who argue for empathy over compassion or vice versa are arguing for people to toggle from one kind of empathetic component to another, not to discard the other one in its entirety. So when it comes to these emotions and feelings beyond our own species, there are many specific examples of how emotion is relevant to environmental decision making more broadly, and I'll mention just a few. So Brown and others in a 2020 paper have found that empathy is a prerequisite for sustainable interactions with the biosphere because pro-environmental behaviours are connected to a sense of place. And that encompasses emotional attachments. So it stands to reason that if we change a place, such as by building a massive uranium mine on it, emotional attachments slacken and so do the protective pro-environmental mechanisms associated with it. Emotional determinants can also be powerful predictors of our behaviour towards wildlife or biodiversity in a broader sense. So for example, 2016 paper by Amit and Jacobson conducted research with ranchers in Costa Rica and found that human behaviour in big cat conflicts was influenced by pre-existing negative emotions towards big cats. So as a result, they suggest that emotions must necessarily be integrated into theoretical frameworks concerning human-wildlife relationships because emotions are used for decision-making in a gradient of analytical versus experiential processes, and they must be addressed if interventions are to be successful. Research has also shown that positive wildlife-related emotions and emotional states like empathy and compassion and sympathy are likely to assist in collaborative efforts to implement compassionate biodiversity management programs. Finally, the link between emotions such as compassion and empathy and environmental awareness or connection has spurred a raft of new disciplines such as eco-psychology, environmental mindfulness, and various art science collaborations. So, how does this relate to invertebrates? So we know that invertebrates make up 95% of all animal and plant life around the globe, but very little attention is paid to them in general. A number of their features position them as something that's less interesting or charismatic or less useful than other vertebrate species, which appears to correlate with fewer demonstrated pro-environmental behaviours being attributed or directed to them. In the field of cultural entomology, an author Hogue has noted how insects are used in a wide variety of cultural instruments to create mostly negatively disposed moods or images. And I'm sure you're all aware of some of those negative feelings yourself that you might have towards particular invertebrates, such as spiders or other insects. We also tend to feel less empathy towards invertebrates when contrasted to vertebrate species because of perceived notions of sentience. So, for example, Feenan suggests that on almost all accounts, compassion is concerned with suffering by a sentient being, whether it's a human or an animal. And many of us believe that invertebrates are not sentient, but entomologists are constantly providing new evidence around the sentience of insects. So not only do we know that most or a lot of the species that we've researched can feel pain, but there is considerable empirical evidence for conscious thought in many insect species through their use of social communication, through their use of problem solving, and their capacity to learn. And we're learning new things about this all of the time. You know, the octopus, a marine invertebrate, has been shown to feel deeply and be one of the most sentient non-human creatures on Earth. There are also studies that show when armed with this information, empathy for invertebrates can increase if people are educated about this information, or so essentially it can be learned. So essentially the empathy for invertebrates, or the lack of empathy for invertebrates, seems to be a problem of misconception. There has been less research around empathetic responses to invertebrate extinction, so species extinction as a whole, but it is arguably linked to these feelings. So Phillipa in a recent paper also argues that we have an emotional response to extinction because it just feels wrong, as I mentioned earlier, and that we use that emotional pull to build a rational argument as to why it's wrong. And that concept is really supported by decision-making science as well. So how does this relate to environmental law? We know that as a general rule, law is structured in a way that is thought to be inconsistent with emotion-based decision-making. Emotions are thought to not be objective. The law is said to make decisions that are consistent and unarbitrary, and emotional responses, thoughts and feelings are not considered akin to such structured decision-making. So to remain consistent, the law considers tangible evidence of harm or wrongdoing, and linking law with an emotion like compassion or empathy has been variously deemed by lawyers and legal theorists and scholars all over the world as a threat to the non-partisan and non-ideological stance of the law. But I want to put to you that that's actually a fallacy in itself, as law is not ideology-free. So for example, Angela Harris argues that ideology in law in itself is a technique of emotional management. So for example, it makes compassion inappropriate by assuring us that the status quo is natural, normal, and necessary. So the question then becomes, what is the ideology of law that makes anthropocentric induced extinction natural, normal, and necessary? Theorists give various answers to this question, and we talk about them extensively in our paper. But for now, I want to put to you that the ideology of law is inconsistent with empathy for species loss. And I'll explain why as I talk about the Yeelirrie case. So the right to mine in Yeelirrie was acquired by the Canadian company Cameco. Cameco proposed to develop a mine covering an area 9 kilometres long and 1.5 kilometres wide in the area that's pictured. It involved clearing up to 2,090 hectares of native vegetation and was projected to cause groundwater levels to drop by up to 7 metres, a level that would not be able to be recovered for at least 100 years, according to Cameco's own public environmental review. Due to the impact on the groundwater, several species of stygofauna, which are invertebrates that inhabit groundwater, and troglofauna, again, I don't know if I'm saying those things right, who knows, they're air-breathing invertebrates that reside in caves below the ground but above the water table, were at risk of serious and irreversible damage. There was a risk that they would go extinct. There was a potential that, as I mentioned, 11 stygofauna and 1 troglofauna species that are known only to occur in that project area could be lost through mining activities. These types of invertebrates that cannot be seen or heard by the ordinary citizen pose an even greater challenge when it comes to empathetic legal reasoning. And I'll talk you through that as we go through that legal decision-making process. So the mine went through a lengthy approval process at both the state and Commonwealth levels here in Australia. So for those of you that aren't based in Australia, our environmental framework is largely state-based, and initial decisions are made through state legislation. However, if the environmental impact of a proposal affects the national interest, then the proposal also has to be approved at the Commonwealth or the national level, and that's essentially what happened here. So subject to the Western Australian Environmental Protection Act, the proponent had to refer, that's Cameco, had to refer the proposal to the Environmental Protection Authority for environmental assessment, which they did in 2014. The Environmental Protection Authority then opened the proposal to public review under Section 40 of the Act. And the response was substantial, to say the least. I won't go into all of those responses, but there were many, many responses. The EPA then had to consider, the Environmental Protection Authority then had to consider those responses and make a determination on the proposal. But their determination was solely limited to environmental matters. Okay, so they're not allowed under the Environmental Protection Act to consider anything outside of environmental matters. And they found in their decision that their environmental objective with respect to subterranean fauna, which is to maintain representation, diversity, viability, and ecological function at the species, population, and assemblage levels, was unable to be met. So in that case, their recommendation was that the mine should not go ahead. The EPA decision can be appealed, and it was, by Cameco and others, although ultimately that appeal was dismissed. And then the EPA report gets sent to the Minister and other relevant decision makers to make a determination on whether the proposal should go ahead or not. So notwithstanding the Environmental Protection Authority's recommendation, the mine was ultimately approved by the Western Australian Environment Minister, excuse me, and other relevant decision makers on 20th of January in 2017. The Minister was not limited to the consideration of environmental matters, but also could make a determination considering economic, commercial, cultural, and other social benefits. In this case, these were the overriding factors, clearly, because the environmental factors were overridden and the EPA's report was overridden by the Minister's decision. But unfortunately, we don't know how exactly, as the Minister's statement was silent on these other factors. The Minister's decision could be appealed via judicial review through the Western Australian courts, and that also happened. It went all the way to the Western Australian Court of Appeal, but the appeal was based on procedure, not substance. And so in essence, the appeal was dismissed and the court did not have the opportunity to address those other factors used or considered by the Minister. Now, if matters of national significance, when there's matters of national significance, as there was with respect to this mine, not just because of the invertebrates, but also because of a number of plant species and the fact that it was a nuclear action, the proposal had to be referred to the National Minister for approval under that Commonwealth Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act that we've already talked about. The mine was granted approval under the EPBC Act on the 10th of April 2019, and the statement of reasons for that decision were made publicly available more than 6 weeks later on the 22nd of May 2019. The minister decided essentially that any risk to the stygofauna communities could be reduced if the mining activities were appropriately conditioned. Now, this was heavily disputed by scientists. More strenuous conditions that would ensure no risk at all to the stygofauna communities were rejected by the minister because they might result in the loss of the project, oh no, and the accompanying social and economic benefits that arose from the project. So here it seems the minister used social benefits in terms of linking them directly to economic benefits. Okay, so the social benefits were the social benefits to people who were going to be employed by the mine, for example, and not social benefits around the loss of place or emotional connection to land or species, or the loss to the local Indigenous communities, who I haven't mentioned yet in this presentation, but were significant and were part of the court appeal, but which are probably a separate paper and a separate topic. Then that decision can be appealed via judicial review, which has not occurred yet. So the EPA review was the only point at which the extinction of species was considered to be an overriding factor. Critical legal theorists have consistently argued that the ideology of law is the maintenance of the capitalist social order. And to be honest, this was quite aptly demonstrated in the Lesley case, because certainly when it comes to environmental law, justice rarely enters into the realm of objectives, or only does so slightly with the inclusion of objectives such as inter and intergenerational equity, which concepts themselves which are easily overwritten by the dominant ideology here. What I want to suggest, I'm being told I have to wrap up. What I want to suggest is that these types of decision-making processes remove the ability to act on empathy, and so remove that feeling from social discourse altogether. The more extinctions we see and feel, the more apathetic towards the concept of extinction we become. So for more detailed analysis on how these concepts are linked, you'll obviously need to read our paper when it's published, but I do want to leave you with a couple of conclusions that we've come up with. So the Lesley case highlights how narratives in legal decision-making around extinction are framed in terms of utility and balancing interests, where human desires and needs are paramount, only from an economic perspective though. This doesn't mean that we don't have an ability to feel empathy or engage in moral reasoning in those cases, but rather the cases impact our exposure to empathy because of the way we characterize rational decision-making. Again, this is not because empathy is irrelevant to decision-making, but because the ideology of law itself ignores the evolutionary nature of society, its ultimate survival, and the cultural empathetic reaction to species extinction. The need to maintain biodiversity for the sake of humanity's survival is not the primary concern of environmental law. Seems ridiculous. And while compassion and empathetic responses occasionally override legal doctrine, as we're currently seeing with koala management in New South Wales in Australia, invertebrates do not ordinarily engender the same response because of the fact that they're creepy and crawly and invertebrates. So if it's not built into the law, there will be no empathetic response. And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Katie. Thank you very much for that. I can see clappings, and I should know gradually I'm just seeing more and more names that I recognize, and if I don't say anything, it's I'm still coming to terms. But Jeremy, I just noticed you're there hiding behind a picture from the US. It must be quite late, so nice to have you here, and look forward to your paper as well. We have less time at the moment, just a couple of probably questions and comments if anyone's got them at this stage. But Katie, thank you very much for that discussion of empathy and its application to the case. So I might invite comments. Michelle, go ahead.
I thought it was really interesting how empathy was such a key theme to all of this, and the points you're making about the shortcomings of law and being unable to engage with that empathy. And I was wondering about the final point you made about how empathy was important for human survival. And I was thinking, is it not even more important to have that empathy regardless of any benefit of a particular species to humans? And I was wondering what your thoughts were in that direction.
Yeah, that's a good question, and something I didn't really expand on because, you know, time. But so the reason that I mentioned that is because there's a lot of science, and this is actually something that Afshin and I have been discussing and perhaps disagree on, but there's a lot of psychological science that suggests that empathy and other compassionate related emotions are a response of evolutionary theory, right? So we have these emotions because they are good for our survival. So they help with, you know, choosing of partners and raising of kids and all of this stuff. So my comment there was that law doesn't include empathy or compassion for a number of reasons, but in so doing ignores that evolutionary process as to why these are relevant to our own survival. But then normally we would then look, you know, at concepts like multi-species justice and things beyond that to see why empathy is relevant to the survival of other species. But as you know, the survival of other species is directly linked to the survival of us as our species. And that's where I was going with that. I hope that makes sense.
Katie, thank you for that response to Michelle. I'm kind of suddenly getting a lot of comments and questions in the chat room, which is great. So Michelle Maloney, thank you, Katie. Paul, you've got your hand up and I'll come to you in one sec. From Union Min, thank you. Phillipa comment. So I've got two questions and I might, I'm just conscious of time. So I want to give Philippa's paper plenty of time, and we've got just 30 minutes left in this session. We have to close it for technological reasons. I might just read the questions quickly, Katie, and then ask Paul to ask his question and then see how you want to answer in response to them.
Yep.
So from Erin O'Donnell, and really nice to see you, Erin. How does a pluralist analysis of law and empathy help? Could other cultural perspectives be useful here? And one from Jeremy, and Jeremy, I've recently read your paper on wonder and absolutely loved it. So it's nice for you to ask that question. Is there a trace in the literature about wonder? One might argue that wonder, even more than empathy, is a relevant orientation towards strange forms of life, those unlike us. Martha Nussbaum, in her work on the capability approach for other species, bases her work in wonder. And wonder, it turns out, is actually what makes sympathetic imagination imaginative. The other thing about wonder is that it is well disposed to the non-instrumental because it brackets practical consideration in the moment. It brackets calculative reasoning. Thank you for your paper, and Jeremy, thank you for your question as well. Michelle, I'll come to your question in a bit, but your next comment, if we have time, if it's okay. Paul, do you want to just quickly ask your comment, and then I'll leave Katie to see what she wants to respond in relation to those so we can move on as well.
Okay, thanks, Afshin. Katie, thank you for the paper. It sort of builds on Michelle's question and Jeremy's comment a little bit, I think. Do you think that in terms of empathy or wonder, as humanity, our inability to empathize is because we have no perception of our own extinction? Extinction and death are questions which I'm not sure humanity ever properly understands. And I do wonder sometimes if this is a psychological, mental, emotional block that we can't empathize with other species because we can't put ourselves into a position where we would possibly be faced with extinction. Now, this has potentially changed with the onset of Anthropocene. But yeah, I'm just sort of interested. It's a bit of a broad question, obviously, but yeah, just interested in what your thoughts are.
I think I can address all of those with one quick statement, in that I think you're all perfectly correct, and I agree with the sentiment that you've just expressed, Paul, that we can't see our own extinction, and one of the reasons for that is because of the way that we've set up our legal systems. It doesn't allow that kind of consideration. It also is because of the way that we've dominated other races, and the racism that's inherent in our systems and our structures, which is coming back to what you're saying, Michelle, and that racism is also inherently contained in our legal system as the indigenous knowledge and the indigenous connection to place were not considered in the decision-making process either. So I think that the way that law frames environmental problems and the way that law addresses environmental problems has that inability, is inherently structured into the decision-making processes to minimise knowledge of extinction, our own extinction and the extinction of others, and the extinction of cultures, and the extinction of thought process, and the extinction of experience. All of those things are embedded deeply into the ideology of law. That's where I'm going to leave that.
All right. Katie, thank you very much for that. And there's a quick comment from Michelle Maloney, First Nation elder and adjunct Professor Mary Graham, talks about empathy being deeply woven into culture and norms in Aboriginal society, is not taken for granted, but taught and ingrained, and as a basic foundation of culture in First Nation culture. Non-Indigenous culture has a lot to learn about how to build empathy back into our culture. And on that note, I also should acknowledge here the tour de force and incredible book Glenn Albrecht has written on Earth Emotions. And Glenn, I intentionally chose not to ask you a question or get you to comment on this paper, just because I've read your work and I don't want any questions. But I want to acknowledge your contribution to this space because it's phenomenal, and it's a real pleasure to have you also participate in this workshop with us. We'll hear from you on Friday as well. Sorry, Glenn, go ahead.
Oh, well, I appreciated that paper very much. So I had plenty to say, but of course, time.
Thank you, Glenn. So we've got 25 minutes left, and I want to introduce Phillipa McCormack, who's here to present. Phillipa is a lecturer in public law at the School of Law, University of Tasmania. Her work has been building around legal frameworks for biodiversity conservation and climate adaptation, and her recent work includes a range of publications on the legal aspects of climate-driven species translocation, ecological restoration, and wetland ecosystem services, bushfires, and climate adaptation. Phillipa, this paper you're presenting is with Charlotte Hunn, who's a research fellow and lecturer at the School of Law, Tasmania. She's with the Institute of Criminology, working on a project on automated internet warnings. And amongst the fun facts, and this will make sense because Charlotte's not here, but you note that she's probably just given birth or is about to give birth or something like that. So she's not here to present with you. And Philippa's fun fact is when she was, and sorry, I'm saying fun facts because we asked each of our speakers to list something. So when you were 17, you left Australia for the first time and you flew to Beijing with your partner and caught a train from there through to Mongolia and Siberia in winter. I tell you, culture shock does not even begin to capture the experience. So Phillipa, it's really nice to have you present, and I've been watching your research career and move on from your PhD, and it's really lovely every time I hear you speak to a new paper and a new body of work. So over to you to present your paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Afshin, for a very generous introduction. I think it's so intimidating being asked to identify a fun fact about yourself, and I like Charlotte's far better. It's much more interesting than mine. But perhaps speaks to the idea that I throw myself into things, and that's certainly the case in this particular talk. So I hope you can see my slides there. This work is at a pretty early stage, and it's a new collaboration for both Charlotte and I, looking at the intersection between this concept of extinction and the things that we've learned from criminal law and from the investigation of human death. Before I sort of launch into the talk itself, a couple of things. So the first is that I am also presenting from Aboriginal land. I have the great honour and privilege of living and working on Muwinina country in Tasmania, which is the southernmost state of Australia. I want to acknowledge their elders past and present and the dispossession of those peoples from their land. This is Aboriginal land and it was never ceded. But also the deep experience and wisdom and creativity that comes from the knowledge of land in the way that Aboriginal people across the world have. And there's some beautiful opportunities that I have had to work with some of the Palawa people from Tasmania to think differently about climate adaptation in the context of millennia rather than the last sort of 50 years. So I want to acknowledge those people and the future that we have together in this space. I also acknowledge Charlotte's work, and she's disappointed, not very disappointed, to not be joining us. She's very distracted. But I have loved working with her. But I also, I describe myself as a recovering positivist. So I started my legal career in commercial law in a big firm, and I apologise in advance that a lot of the work that I do, I have to keep reminding myself it's not just about a technical interpretation of legal instruments and analysis by courts, but particularly in the context of extinction, it falls into a much broader context of grief and history and connection and joy and wonder. Oh my word, what a brilliant way to think about it. So off we go, and I really look forward to the conversation. There's a fantastic audience with huge diversity of expertise. So the core sort of purpose of my talk is that recognising this concept of extinction, the human role in accelerating extinctions of species around the world, and the looming threat and current experience of climate change. The role of law and of policy should be to reduce and not to increase the risk of extinction. It possibly seems kind of obvious, but it is absolutely the case that the law has been a mechanism for creating, sustaining and exacerbating the stresses that cause extinction. And so we see that actively through legal support and permitting arrangements for habitat destruction and land clearing, for agriculture, urban expansion, and increasingly, particularly in Australia, for bushfire hazard reduction activities. But also passively through the failure to effectively prevent activities that cause extinctions. And the spread of those activities is enormous, but include, for example, the failure to effectively curtail the spread of pathogens such as Phytophthora cinnamomea. It's like a root rot, which has been huge in Australia, for native trees, and chytrid fungus, which has decimated amphibian populations. Biosecurity laws haven't worked in the way they should have. Failing to impose prohibitions on roaming-owned cats, for example, and the extinctions, local extinctions in particular, that cats cause. Feral cats in Australia are a huge problem. So the law has this role to play in creating the conditions for extinction, but also offers some of the best opportunities that we have to respond and address and hopefully mitigate extinctions in the future. So, for example, our laws support tools such as the creation of public, private and Indigenous protected areas with secure, ongoing tenure and effective management regimes. I'm being really hopeful and positive. To impose catch limits and export restrictions and penalties for destroying habitat and so on. Restoration obligations, tools for habitat protection such as critical habitat listings and so on. So there is both a negative and a positive story to be told about the law in this space, and I'm going to touch on some of the different kind of legal framework before I move on to talk about what kind of criminal frameworks might offer us in terms of thinking about this issue. But the core point is that the law can and ought to play a role in creating opportunities to learn from loss so that we don't continue to repeat our mistakes. It's not alone in creating these opportunities for learning, but it's a tool that we need to use better. And I have a little clip there. I recently found myself at the Victoria Gallery up in Launceston, a city in Tasmania, where they have a really beautiful and tragic display about the extinction of the thylacine, which is the Tasmanian tiger, the largest carnivorous marsupial to recently become extinct. My grandparents were alive when the last one died, and it's a tragic story because once a species is extinct, corrective legislation doesn't help. Our time to act, to seek reform is now. So just very briefly, Afshin touched on this at the beginning, the international law, at least implicitly, seeks to prevent extinctions. So there's no reference to the term in the Convention on Biological Diversity, but other conventions, such as the Convention on Migratory Species, do provide in some of the articles, specifically preventing habitat loss is about preventing extinction, for example. And we see underneath those formal legal instruments, these strategic plans and agendas, which are about implementing those international instruments. So the HE biodiversity target number 12 says by 2020, the extinction of known threatened species has been prevented and their conservation status, particularly of those in most decline, has been improved and sustained. Everyone on this call will know we have demonstrably failed to meet that target, but it's the first explicit target that we had, which is a really great start. And it'd be interesting to see what the next strategic plan provides for. Sustainable Development Goal 15.5 says that, or invites us to take urgent and significant action to reduce the degradation of habitat and the loss of biodiversity and to prevent extinction of threatened species. So we see that finds its place in national law in Australia, and the goals of our laws do explicitly in many cases and definitely implicitly in others seek to prevent extinction. So one of the purposes of the EPBC Act, this national legislation in Australia, is to protect native species and in particular prevent extinction and promote recovery. And the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, just to give an example of a state-based piece of legislation, is to guarantee that all taxa, Victoria's flora and fauna, can persist and improve in the wild. So the goal is absolutely, certainly there, represented in our law to prevent extinction. But the outworking of those goals is more complicated, as those who've spoken before me have suggested. So one of the most important tools that we have is the threatened species list. So we have that at the international scale in the IUCN Red lists, but in Australia there's a national list and there are state lists as well, and they don't always say the same things. But once a species has been listed as threatened, then other sort of legal tools come into play. So this goes to Tom Van Doren's question earlier. It is an offence in the Act to take, and take has a technical legal definition, and the definition includes killing, destroying species or their habitat, disturbing them, taking their eggs, wrecking their nests, and so on, without a permit. The trick is you can get a permit. So you can actually get a permit to kill species that are listed as threatened and on their way to extinction, which from a I don't know, that seems crazy, but I've got some examples there along the bottom of the screen, and the one on the left is this beautiful little migratory parrot that spends some of its time in Tasmania and some time in Victoria. It's a swift parrot, and there is at the moment in place an arrangement for forestry activities in Tasmania which destroy some of its best known habitat in Tasmania. It's listed as, I believe, critically endangered under the national list, also in Tasmania and also internationally, but the forestry agreement in place is specifically permitting forestry agency to destroy their habitat, despite the fact that the recovery plan for the species identifies habitat loss as the primary cause of its threatened status. A similar position for the leadbeater's possum there, which is Victoria's faunal emblem. Its habitat has been destroyed through the statutory agency's forestry operations. It's been the subject of some legal analysis recently in federal court actions. Interestingly, so the other three are a bit different. So I've got a little picture there in the centre of spectacled flying foxes. And in Queensland, local councils have a particular status under the Act which allows them to, as of right, to destroy a roost and attempt to drive away colonies of flying foxes in particular areas, flying fox management areas. And what that means is that local councils can progressively destroy roosts entirely, and there is some discussion about the possibility of this action, authorised under law, leading to the extinction of this species in combination with heat stress and heat waves. The red-tailed black cockatoo, some fire hazard management activities in Victoria. It's a listed threatened species. They actively destroyed its habitat, and the response from the federal government was, we'll do a strategic assessment into fire reduction activities. And the little black-throated finch, a shout out to Dr. April Reeside, who is a passionate advocate for this species, has its best habitat right within the boundaries of the proposed Adani Carmichael mine, and its extinction has essentially been permitted. Hasn't taken place yet, but so the law doesn't do what it's supposed to do in that respect. There are too many workarounds, and I should just note before I move on, the issue is that there's no specific, more serious offence for causing extinction. So you can achieve permits to kill and take particular individuals and populations, but if that leads to the global extinction of a species, that isn't a new and different offence, which is a big problem. So this is the definition from the Act, and I wanted to point this out, goes to Lesley's point earlier. We know that species won't survive in many cases in the habitat that they've historically been distributed in, and so there's a role for translocation and various other interventions. The Federal Act in Australia describes or defines species that only survive as naturalised populations outside their past range as extinct in the wild. So there's potentially some work to be done in updating our laws. So again, as Lesley said, there's no accountability, you don't have to report them, you don't have to investigate them, and you don't have to learn, which is outrageous. And we have missed so many opportunities to learn from the loss of species in Australia, and that's something that we need to change. There are some legal tools that do support learning. You need information to learn, and so having to prepare plans and objectives and reporting obligations help in that task. We have mandatory review provisions that sometimes are not undertaken, but they do exist. Sunset clauses, it's where a rule or a regulation just expires, and if you don't update it or review it, then it ceases to exist. And we have these formal review bodies. And there's quite a few different ones. I've got a couple of examples there, but I'm going to move on to talk just very briefly in the time that I have left, sorry Afshin, about the Coroner's Court. Now I'm drawing on this paper by John Wynarski and colleagues in conservation biology, where they suggested that an inquiry by a coroner at the point of extinction would be a great contribution to learning in this context. And I agree with them. And I wanted to sort of investigate, well, what does the Coroner's Court actually offer us? What kinds of tools are in place, and what might we learn from that institution to respond to extinction and to do better? So the Coroner's Court, it's a legal institution with a mandate to facilitate learning in circumstances of tragedy. So it's specifically established to investigate human deaths. And we have this essentially a court that's established with an independent legal officer, usually a judge or a magistrate or a very senior lawyer, who brings together information, has a legal mandate, a power, if you will, to bring information in from various experts, including through public inquiries, which is the term inquests, that relate to a reportable death. So the concept of a reportable death includes homicides and suicides, so violent death, accidental or unexpected deaths, and deaths of children and people in custody or in care. I invite you to think about the analogy of extinction and the possibility of using a tool like this for deaths that involve active, violent destruction of species populations and the global representation of species, accidental or unexpected extinctions, and the death of species that are in custody or in care. There's a really clear kind of analogy between those different categories. So the the coroner makes findings and recommendations but doesn't allocate blame. And as a public lawyer, let me tell you, I feel quite strongly about this. As soon as you have a mechanism that allocates blame, that creates an opportunity to pursue penalties through a court system, that creates a space where you will often see the suppression of information and efforts at blame avoidance. And that's, I'm not condemning our public servants at all. A lot of them care deeply and act as much as they can in the interests of the species they're responsible for. But the culture and the context of blame allocation can be really problematic for learning. And we've certainly seen that in the legal sort of framework for the administration of government. I think we would probably see that in the context of extinctions too. So one of the really great opportunities is to reveal information without necessarily saying it's your fault. And so Judge Ian Gray says it's all about system change and prevention. It's all about prevention of the next opportunity or the next occasion where this might occur. So I know we're running close to time, so I just want to, I can speak about this in great deal, and you should read the paper because it's going to be really great. But I wanted to highlight in particular the fact that the findings are about explaining what happened in this particular case. Essentially a task similar to what Lesley presented. These are all the different factors that contributed in the case of a species extinction. And then recommendations about what we might do differently. And one of the really interesting things that comes out of the coronial inquest process is this idea of situational crime prevention. Now, extinction's no crime, so we can't directly apply that tool without quite a bit of thought. But one of the interesting things that it offers is this idea that in criminology, in understandings and theories of crime, we know that punishment is not the thing, actually, that deters criminal behaviour or offending. It's actually very, very, the link between punishment and deterrence is really tenuous and sometimes non-existent. But what we do know is that a lot of offending behaviour happens when the stars align and the circumstances are right. And so one of the things that comes out of coronial inquests is, well, what made the offence easier, possible in this case? And so we see, for example, a series of coronial inquests that children dying in pools have led to a mandatory or an obligation to always have pool fencing. You can't just have a pool without pool fencing because children have died, and this recommendation has come up in these reports from coroners, and it's now it's a penalty to have a pool without a fence. Drawing on the situational crime prevention, we know that a lot of violent offences happen in dark streets, and so street lighting becomes this way of reducing the risk of offending in those places. Seatbelts came out of coronial inquests and inquiries about harm and speed and car collisions. So if we could apply these ideas about situational crime prevention, recognising that extinction more often happens when you see a coincidence between, for example, habitat loss and extreme events like heat waves, or you know, in places that are peri-urban as opposed to urban, we might be able to draw out the different factors that lend themselves to extinctions and really target our effort at addressing those, maximise the opportunities to prevent them. So I do have a little comparison of the strengths and weaknesses, but I'm going to stop, and I'm happy to share my slides if that's something that you want, Afshin, so that we have a couple of minutes for questions.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Phillipa. So, and I see a round of claps coming up. I mean, there's a number of really exciting things about your paper. One is the idea of this culture of learning, but also drawing from, you know, other ways of thinking and seeing how learning happens and bringing that into a conversation with Extinction. So thank you for that. Look, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes, and I've been asked to finish on time just because the next session has to start in another Zoom address. But let me open it up and see where the questions might be here, and we'll go from there and see how long we need. So thoughts, comments, questions, and thank you, Phillipa.
I have a small question, if no one else is. Thanks, Phillipa. I wondered if you, even though the inquest model, coronial inquest, is not a doesn't allocate blame, I assume there's something about the way in which it identifies responsibility or culpability, or that at least plays a significant role in beyond learning, in sort of, I don't know if shaming is the right word, but in encouraging governments or whoever's responsible to do better, because they are worried about this kind of official evaluation of their performance. Is that an element of what you're suggesting?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you, Tom. So one of the provisions that we have in the Australian sort of laws about coronial inquests and so on is a really unusual one. So Victoria requires that the government respond. And so in many cases around Australia, the recommendations are just posted online and handed perhaps to the Attorney General. In Victoria, the recommendations, the government has 3 months, or the responder, they call them. So it might be, you know, a commercial enterprise, but the government has, or the responder has the obligation to respond within 3 months of the recommendations being published. And so they have to identify what we're doing to make sure this doesn't happen again, how we're going to fix this problem. And I mean, I showed you a few examples of what has been achieved because coroners have identified problems. And I think that the evidence suggests that they are very persuasive reports, in fact, when that's put out there in that level of detail and there's a clear indication of what went wrong. We have seen governments respond. So it's not going to work on its own. You know, and if you had a particularly cynical government, you may not get that outcome. But the benefit is then you can feed into electoral processes and you can empower people to demand better. Thanks for the question.
That's great, Phillipa. There's a comment in the chat room just from Jeremy, really interesting. This isn't a question, just a comment, a suggestion of a book, Read Coronial Inquests. And there's a hyperlink there for us to look at. Any other questions or comments to Phillipa and Charlotte before we wrap up? Well, I've been privately sent a note saying there isn't another Zoom address. It's actually just the same one, but we just need to take a break to facilitate the next one. So everyone just use the same address to come back in, but we'll take a break for those of you who are coming back. Comment from Erin also saying, impressive, thank you. And Union Win, thank you. Again, a comment to you, Phillipa, saying well done. And from Michelle, excellent paper, fascinating issues. Just a comment, people's tribunals are also valuable because of their capacity to deeply explore legal and other issues, develop findings and make recommendations. Here's a terrific example from the Australian People's Tribunal that I was a part of, citizen inquiry into the health of the Barker-Darling River, with a link there. And a comment, final one from Union Win saying, Phillipa, most governments did well in paperworks in environmental affairs. Are they mainly responsible for national laws in line with international legal provisions which they have committed to? If we want clarification.
So, yeah, I mean, I think I can. So I think if I've understood the question, the federal government, the Australian Commonwealth government, signs up to international agreements and has primary responsibility, for example, to report how Australia is going in line with those agreements and commitments. But the state governments have the primary responsibility for environmental law in Australia and also for criminal law. So the inquest kind of procedure in Australia happens exclusively at the state level. So there's an interesting disjunct there, which is bigger than this particular challenge, that what state governments are doing, the federal government has to take, if not responsibility for, at least to sort of report on how that feeds into us meeting our national obligations. And it's one of the big problems associated with devolving or sending down that small part of environmental law that the federal government is responsible for to state governments, because it separates entirely all of the action that Australia is responsible for on an international stage from the federal government, and they would be reporting then exclusively on what state governments are doing and not taking any responsibility for that action themselves. So that separation is a quirk, a problematic one.
Yeah,
thanks.
your response.
Oh, thanks. Yes.
Lesley, can I ask, did you want to ask a question? You're off mute, so I just wanted to know if you had a comment.
No, sorry, that was a mistake.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, can I ask us all just to thank Phillipa and also to thank Lesley and Katie for their presentations. What a great session to start off this workshop, and I'm really pleased to say we're going to take a break at 11:30, so about 45 minutes from now. We'll come back, and I'm going to hand over to Paul Govin, who's going to chair that session. But I'm really looking forward to listening to Tom Van Doorn speak, Michelle Lim, and Alexandra. Are you still here? Alexandra, are you here? So we're really looking forward to your 3 papers in the next session, which is to come. And we'll stop now. We'll end this session and come back. Thank you, everyone, for participating, for questions, presenters, and everyone else who helped. We'll see you back at 11:30. I don't know what time zone. It's not even Australian Eastern Standard Time. It's Brisbane time. See you all in 45 minutes.
Yeah.
Thank you again.